Alright, now that we have gotten the takeoff and the landing and some of the basic situational awareness out of the way, now we get to talk about ridge flying. And the first thing that we really, care a lot about when we fly the ridge is positioning on the ridge. We want to be in the sweet spot, and the sweet spot basically defines the place on the ridge where the lift is best. And so you have to position yourself correctly, both horizontally and vertically, that you line up with the strongest part of the lift. So to start out this demonstration, we actually are right square down on the treetops. Later on, we'll talk about ridge testing and the process by which you get here and all that sort of thing. But before we get into all that, we want to talk about positioning, and it's actually easier to talk about positioning on the ridge down low. And the reason is because down low the band is much more kind of sharply defined. So the lift tends to be strongest down low, about 100 feet above the trees or so. And the positioning it's a bit more clear. So we want to fly over the crest of the ridge. We like to put, as my instructor likes to say, the left armpit of the glider over the mountain, not the fuselage itself. You want to be not directly over the middle of the mountain, but in front of it a little bit, because the air gets bunched up on the front side. Directly over the middle, it just kind of flattens out and goes to nothing. Also, when we think about the ridge band, while it's strongest in this position, in the sweet spot, if you go a little bit too far upwind, it will still work. It doesn't work quite as well, but it still works. If you go a little bit too far downwind, it doesn't work at all. So first, we'll just fly along in the sweet spot, and we'll see we're doing pretty well. We're going in this case, about 70 miles an hour, a little over 70, pretty much right along down in the treetops. Now watch what happens if I go too far downwind. So if I'm right directly over the top of the mountain, I mean, it's a terrible place to be, but watch, there's no lift here. See? I'm in a little bit of sink. And yet if I go a little bit further to the right, just about 100 yards, see how much stronger the lift is. And so the first lesson here is, when it comes to positioning, the lift a little bit too far downwind, very bad. No lift, or much, much weaker. And when you're down low, it's straight obvious. You don't want to be there. But in any case, it's just to understand that the band is pretty sharply defined, in this case off to our left. But now let's go a little bit further upwind. So we're going to get a little bit higher in the sweet spot, and then we're going to push out a little bit further upwind. We're going to go further and further and further and further. Notice I'm still in lift. I'm in lift, I'm in lift, I'm in lift. I'm still in lift. And bear in mind, I actually turned the thermals off today, so this is all ridge lift. And right about here, it started to weaken out. Now it's about 0. So we're going to stop right here. So, take a gather of this. 100 yards or 50 yards a little bit too far to the left, over the top of the mountain, we went from strong lift to nothing. And in this case, we went almost a half mile upwind. In real life, down low tends to be a little bit more compressed, but even then, you'll still find pretty good air as you go out on the slope. And while this is much more stark down in the treetops, the same is true up high, and we'll show this a little bit later. But before we do that, we're going to tuck back into the mountain and get into that nicer ridge lift. And notice, it's about 0, it's about 0, and then once we get right up to the crest, it's going to get quite a bit stronger. There we go. Much better. So, again, this is to reinforce we want to be in the sweet spot, and the sweet spot in this case is right above the crest of the mountain, not too far downwind, right over the steep part. But the lift works quite a bit upwind. You go a little bit too far downwind, doesn't work hardly at all. Now let's get a little bit higher. So we're going to float our way up, and we're going to go and slow down and work our way up into the higher band. And as we do this, we notice how I'm pushing away from the mountain. I tucked a little bit to the right, and I'm pushing away to the right. And the reason for that is, as you get higher, the lift band gets pushed away from the ridge. And you have to keep working your way a little bit further and further away from the ridge in order to get into that really good lift. Still climbing pretty nicely. Okay. Oh, right. Now we are 400 feet higher, and in some pretty decent lift. In this case, notice we are quite a bit further away from the ridge than when we were down on the crest. But the lift band gets pushed further and further away as you get higher. By the time you're at 2,400 feet, on a pretty good day, you might even be almost a half mile sometimes upwind of where you would be if you were screaming along down in the treetops. But the thing to note is that the sweet spot, it gets a little bit wider as you get higher, but that relationship of the lift band being basically pretty nice, but a little bit weaker to the upwind side. So it's definitely you want to be in the right spot. But if you're a little bit too far upwind, it still works okay. But if you go a little bit too far downwind, very quickly it drops off, and that is really, really important to remember, because as you fly the ridge, a lot of people, when they get into that sweet spot, they get in the strong spot, there's a tendency to fall out the back. And I'll show exactly how that works, especially when you're up higher. And this is why it's actually harder to float. So some common errors are, number one is the tendency not to fly a crab correctly. So in this case, as you notice, we're keeping our wings level, and our nose is pointed considerably off the mountain because we're crabbing into the wind. But what a lot of people like to do is they like to look at the mountain further along, and they try to align their nose to the ridge in front of them, like that. And that, at minimum, what they end up doing is they end up flying in a slip. But the other thing they end up doing is they end up, say, tucking their nose down and aiming their eyes out further, and then they end up doing this kind of thing where you end up drifting off to the right, to the left, and then you end up, you find that the lift gets weaker, and then you sort of drift your way back to the right and kind of hunt around for it all the time. And the thing to look for there, particularly in real life, is notice this, notice the stick pressure. Notice what you're doing with the rudder pedals. If you're consistently finding that you're, say, holding right stick, well, that's telling you that that lift is more consistently strong off the right wing. Or if you're consistently finding that the gusts are strong, they're pushing up on your left wing, that tells you, hey, maybe you ought to adjust a little bit to the left. And that's how we do this known error kind of flying, and particularly so when you're up high. But the thing is, in order to do that, you have to keep your wings perfectly level, and you have to know what perfectly neutral means on your stick and your pedals. Because if you're consistently flying with the pressure, like let's say if I'm putting a little bit of left rudder all the time, now I'm going to have to consistently hold a little bit of right pressure, and it gets much harder to find that sweet spot up high. And then finally, and as we do this, the other thing to note is keep if you're going to go and err to one side or the other, always err to the upwind side, and I like to err to keeping my right wing infinitesimally low. Meaning you're never exactly 90 degrees because there's a little bit of turbulence, a little bit of this and that. And so if I'm ever going to go and err to one side being lower than the other, I'm always going to err to be keeping the upwind side low. And the other thing is if I hit turbulence or if I hit a little bit of a gust, I never ever let my left wing drop, the downwind wing drop. So if I hit a gust that goes like this, I'm going to be right on top of the controls, and I'm going to push hard to the right and actually even angle a little bit to the right and pull off of it and head into the wind. And the reasoning there is, again, going downwind is really, really, really bad. We do not want to ever drift downwind at the optimal part of the band because we know it gets much weaker out there. If we feel like we're in the sweet spot, you don't want to ever be pushed into the worst spot. You always want to be a little bit, if you're going to be a little bit off, you're going to want to be a little bit off on the upwind side. And if you ever have a turbulence that wants to push you into the downwind side, well, you don't let that happen, and you push yourself away into the upwind side and do that pretty quickly. And so that's kind of the story with positioning, and we started by positioning ourselves low and seeing how the lift works at ridgetop, and we found a little bit too far downwind, very bad, a little bit too far upwind, not so bad, not as strong, but it still works. And then we went higher and kind of saw how the lift band changes there. And then along the way, we pay a lot of attention to how we controlled the glider. We want to make sure that we have really good airspeed control. That we're able to keep the pitch exactly where we want it, and we want to make sure that we can fly with the stick and the pedals perfectly level, perfectly neutral, and fly that crab with a perfect 90-degree angle to the parallel with the horizon. And if we're gonna err to one side or the other in terms of that, we're gonna err to keep the upwind wing low. Never ever ever let that downwind wing be pushed up and let yourself be drifted too far downwind. Very bad things happen when that happens.